Rebecca had always been fascinated by unusual things. Her love for antiques began in childhood when she accidentally found an old brooch in her grandmother's jewelry box. Since then, she became a real collector of vintage items. Any old, worn objects that held a history were priceless to her. One day, while walking through the outskirts of London, she noticed a small shop that looked like it had been there for centuries. Crooked walls and a sagging wooden door suggested that inside there would surely be fascinating finds. When Rebecca stepped inside, the air was dense, saturated with the smell of dust and time. All around were dozens of strange objects, old books, paintings, furniture, and jewelry, but her gaze was immediately drawn to one thing: a large mirror in a heavy wooden frame. It was an odd mirror, with carvings on its edges that resembled ancient runes or some kind of magical symbols. It looked both majestic and eerie at the same time, as if something more than just a reflection was trapped inside. The shopkeeper, an old man with white hair and deep wrinkles, watched Rebecca closely as she stood before the mirror. He smiled when he noticed her interest. "That mirror is special," he said quietly but confidently. "It was brought from Eastern Europe, from an old estate. Legend has it that it's connected to something otherworldly." Rebecca laughed, though her laugh was nervous. She didn't believe in ghosts or legends, but the mirror somehow captivated her. "It's beautiful," she said, ignoring the shopkeeper's words about its mystical properties. "I'll take it." The old man nodded, but his smile faded, replaced with a serious expression. "Just be careful," he said as the deal was made. A few days later, the mirror was already hanging in her home, in her bedroom, where it took a place of honor on the wall opposite the bed. Rebecca was pleased with the purchase, but soon began to notice strange things. Every time she passed by the mirror, it seemed to her that her reflection moved just a bit slower than she did. Sometimes, when she looked into it, she saw something strange flickering in the background, though there was no one in the room besides her. She chalked it up to fatigue, but the more time passed, the more often these moments occurred. Over the next week, the strange events began to intensify. One evening, while brushing her teeth in the bathroom, Rebecca noticed that her reflection in the mirror had stopped for a moment, even though she continued to move. She froze, holding her breath. Her reflection's eyes seemed foreign. The gaze was cold and sharp, like that of a predator. "I'm just tired," she whispered to herself, trying to calm down. But the next day, things got even worse. Waking up in the middle of the night, Rebecca felt a strange cold in the room. She slowly turned toward the mirror, and it seemed to her that her reflection was watching her, though she hadn't fully turned her head yet. The reflection moved just a bit faster than she did, as if it had a will of its own. Her heart raced in her chest, and she tried to ignore the fear. But now, mirrors had become a constant source of unease for her. Her reflection was always just slightly off, not quite as it should be. It was as if someone else was using the mirror to watch her. One evening, she decided to cover the mirror with a cloth. For 2 days, this helped. She felt lighter. But on the night of the third day, she had a strange dream. Someone in the darkness was whispering her name. She woke up in a cold sweat and found that the cloth had slipped off the mirror and lay crumpled on the floor, revealing its surface. A few days later, things took a turn for the worse. Now, every morning when Rebecca approached the mirror, she felt more than just fear. Her reflection had become more real, more sinister. It seemed as though something inside the mirror was watching her, moving in time with her thoughts but not her actions. She tried to look away, but the mirror pulled her gaze like a magnet. One night, as she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she suddenly felt a touch on her hand. It was cold, but not physical, more like a shadow brushing against her skin. She sat up abruptly, peering into the dark room, but there was no one there. Only her own breathing broke the silence. But then she heard a faint whisper. "Rebecca?" Her heart stopped. The whisper came from the mirror. She slowly got out of bed, her body frozen with fear. In the mirror she saw her reflection, but behind it, something else was beginning to take shape. A dark figure, blurry but steadily approaching. "This is just a dream. It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, but everything felt too real. The figure inside the mirror slowly raised a hand, and its fingers began to reach for the surface, as if trying to break through. The following days became unbearable for Rebecca. Her life seemed to freeze on the edge of reality and a nightmare. The mirror was no longer just an object in her home. It had become a living, breathing entity, watching her every move. Every time she looked at it, she felt like someone inside was waiting. One night, when she tried to sleep, she felt the cold closing around her body again. This time, she didn't wake up from a touch, but something was pressing on her mind, forcing her to see strange images, shadows moving inside the mirror, faces twisted in fear. The mirror had become a portal, opening before her into something much darker than she could imagine. She decided to seek help. But every time she tried to dial her best friend Tom's number, something stopped her. The mirror seemed to whisper to her that no help would come, that this was her fate. Rebecca hardly left her house anymore. Every time she tried to step outside, a strange feeling pulled her back to the mirror. Her mind was filled with thoughts that something inside the mirror was waiting for her, calling to her. She no longer believed this was just her imagination. Fear and doubt prevented her from sleeping, eating, or thinking clearly. One day, in a moment of desperation, she finally called Tom. His voice was warm and friendly as always. "Rebecca, you haven't called in a while. Is everything okay?" he asked. And Rebecca felt relieved just hearing his familiar voice. "No," she admitted, her voice weak. "Tom, I think I'm losing my mind. This mirror, I can't explain it. Something's happening. I'm seeing things that can't be real." Tom was silent for a moment, then cautiously asked, "Do you want me to come over and take a look?" "You're probably just tired. I'm sure there's an explanation." Rebecca sighed deeply. She wanted to agree, but something inside her resisted the idea. It was as if something didn't want Tom to get involved. She glanced at the mirror. It seemed darker and deeper than usual, as if hiding another reality inside. "I don't know, Tom. I'm not sure," she whispered. "I'll come over tomorrow," Tom said with determination. "We'll figure it out." After hanging up, Rebecca felt a strange unease. She sat on her bed, but couldn't take her eyes off the mirror. This time her reflection seemed strange, distant. For a moment she thought her eyes in the mirror were a bit darker than usual, her pupils too wide. But the most terrifying part was that her reflection didn't move with her. It lagged just slightly, as if it had a will of its own. When night fell, Rebecca tried to distract herself, but every movement brought her back to the mirror. Once again, she felt the cold creeping down her spine as she heard a faint whisper coming from deep within the reflection. "Rebecca?" She turned sharply to the mirror. This time her reflection wasn't her. The figure in the mirror resembled her, but only in a general sense. The face was twisted in a strange smile, the eyes far too dark, the gaze predatory, like a creature waiting for its prey. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, and Rebecca felt her body freeze in terror. The reflection's hand slowly reached for the surface of the glass, and then pressed against it from the inside. The glass trembled, as if unable to withstand the pressure from the other side, and Rebecca saw her own hand involuntarily reaching out toward the mirror. She didn't want this, but she couldn't stop herself. When her fingers touched the glass, it trembled even more, as if it were a thin film about to break. Her reflection smiled wider, its eyes narrowing, and in the next moment, the surface of the mirror seemed to dissolve, becoming liquid. Rebecca felt her hand plunge through the glass. In panic, she tried to pull it back, but something grabbed her from the other side. Cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, pulling her in. "No," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the hollow echo. Darkness behind the mirror pulled her in, and she felt her body slowly sinking into another world. Suddenly, the room went quiet. Tom arrived the next day to find Rebecca's apartment door slightly ajar. He called her name several times, but there was no response. Tom entered, passing through the strange cold that filled the apartment. When he entered the bedroom, the mirror was dark, like a void. On the floor lay only a scrap of Rebecca's shirt, but she was nowhere to be found. Tom cautiously approached the mirror, looking at his own reflection, but in the darkness, something seemed off. For a moment, it seemed like the reflection wasn't moving in sync with him, and the dark eyes staring back at him from the mirror were not his own. Tom stood before the mirror, feeling a strange, suffocating wrongness filling the room. He carefully studied his reflection, trying to understand what was wrong. The sensation that he wasn't alone grew stronger. Another second passed, and his hand involuntarily reached toward the mirror, as if something were calling him. But unlike Rebecca, Tom managed to stop himself in time. He took a step back, suddenly feeling a strange coldness, and saw something dark slowly taking shape in the depths of the mirror. It was a figure, no longer resembling a human, but rather a grotesque, twisted version of one. "Rebecca?" he whispered, his voice barely audible as fear began to seize his body. A faint whisper, like a sigh or a moan, came from the mirror. The faces inside the mirror warped and began to change, becoming more terrifying, faceless. It no longer reflected his world. It was a window into another dimension, full of shadows and indistinct figures. In that moment, Tom realized that this mirror was not just a window. It was a portal connected to something ancient and evil. The figure inside the mirror continued to approach, its dark eyes glowing with a cold light. Tom took a step back, stumbling against the wall, unable to look away. The mirror vibrated, its surface rippling, and suddenly a black hand, like a shadow, extended out of it. This hand wasn't solid. It was made of darkness, distorting everything around it. It grabbed Tom by the wrist, just as it had done to Rebecca, and began pulling him in. "No," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the hollow emptiness of the room. He struggled with all his might, but the dark hand was stronger. Its coldness pierced through him, freezing his body and mind. He felt himself being dragged in, his very essence starting to dissolve, losing its connection to reality. And then, in one final desperate move, he pushed the mirror. The force caused it to wobble, and with a deafening crash, it fell to the floor, shattering into countless shards. Tom stood there, breathing heavily, looking around. The floor was covered with shards of the broken mirror. But he immediately realized this wasn't the end. Something had changed. The shadows seemed to still linger in the air, and the room was enveloped in a thick, almost living darkness. He looked at the shards and froze. Instead of his own reflection, in each piece of glass, he saw something different. In one shard, his own figure was reflected, but its face was distorted, with empty eyes and a twisted smile. In another, Rebecca, but her eyes were completely black, and she was silently reaching out to him from the depths of the reflection. Tom realized that even after the mirror was destroyed, its power remained. The shards were now a new doorway. Something had changed inside him as he looked at those faces. His own reflection had become foreign, dark, and he felt his consciousness starting to blur. From the depths of the shards, the faint voices continued to whisper his name. He tried to resist, but something had already begun to take hold of him, pulling him into the dark abyss. "You're with us now," a distorted voice whispered from the shards, echoing as if from far away. Looking one last time into a shard, Tom saw his own reflection smirking before the shadows finally consumed him completely. He could no longer resist. His body had become part of those shards. 2 days later, in Rebecca's apartment, now considered a crime scene due to her disappearance, her brother James arrived. He had come to search for any clues that could shed light on what had happened to his sister. Entering her bedroom, he saw only silence and small shards of glass on the floor. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as he passed by, James accidentally kicked one of the shards with his foot. The shard turned, and his gaze fell on his reflection. Inside the shard, he saw a face that wasn't his own. It looked at him with a cunning smile, and its eyes glowed with a sinister gleam. The mirror had been broken, but its power remained. The shadows that lived inside still waited for those who dared to look into their eyes.